China's annual political season begins in Beijing. We'll discuss the top priorities for this year and beyond. Hello, I'm Arnold Knight, and this is The Heat. Thousands of legislators and advisors joined President Xi Jinping at the Great Hall of the People for the annual political meetings known as Two Sessions. The Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, or CPPCC, opened on Friday, and China's top legislature, known as the National People's Congress, opens on Saturday. China's economy, trade, diplomacy, and the environment are expected to be part of the discussions. Well, for more now on China's Two Sessions, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Oregon is Yan Liang. She's a professor of economics at Willamette University. From Shanghai, Joseph Gregory Mahoney is a professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University. Here in Washington, D.C., Cheng Li is director of the China Center and senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. And Aina Tangen is a political and economic affairs commentator in Beijing. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Aina Tangen, Chinese President Xi Jinping, he attended the opening of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, also known as the CPPCC, and of course the National People's Congress starts later on Saturday. These are important meetings. They set the agenda for China and the Chinese people. So what do you think are the top priorities this time?
Well, quite clearly, with the kind of unrest in the world, the economy is going to take the center stage. There's still going to be a lot of, concern about how social progress continues in the country. Whole process democracy, the CCPCC is part of that very clearly, and noticeably. There has been a lot more activity in that area. And in the previous few years, you've seen smaller ideas being put forward and things like that, but you have a lot of delegates now talking about population, about the COVID-19 and things like that. So it's going to be an interesting session. Remember, this first part is the advisory body. It's kind of like the elder group who are advising the government about the people's concerns. And it's going to be increasingly important, especially as China embraces this whole process democracy.
So would the main concern for the Chinese people be the economy, Anna?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially right now in view of recent events in Russia and Ukraine and the kind of, outpouring, what's going to happen because of that. These are two countries that are responsible for 25% of the world's exported wheat. Other grains, also strategic things like neon gas, which is necessary for chip making, automobiles. This is going to be a very, very difficult year. And the question is, does China embrace a hard number or go back to times of uncertainty during COVID and say, look, we're going to have a range and keep it soft?
Cheng Li, let's talk about the COVID pandemic. Of course, the pandemic is still with us. It's now into its third year. China has adopted a policy known as the zero COVID policy. And ahead of this meeting, Chinese legislators have been calling for a uniform national policy on how to deal with this pandemic. And they want to contain the pandemic, but at the same time not hurt the economy. So do you see this zero COVID policy continuing?
Well, I think at least for next few months, because as we know that Hong Kong is confronting serious challenges, 56,000 infected on March 3rd, and 200 people died that day. And also China's neighboring countries such as South Korea and Vietnam, each has more than 100,000 per day. Japan also has more cases than United States. So that's the background. Now, ultimately, it depends on how the COVID situation changes. There are so many things we still don't know about this virus, and it's very aggressive mutation. Now, people can express their reservations about the zero tolerance policy, draconian measures of the Chinese government in handling the pandemic, and the huge economic costs of this policy, and also implication for China if many other countries develop herd immunity. But we should at least be aware of the devastating multifaceted impact if China loses control over COVID. According to one Chinese study, as many as 4 million people in China could have died if the Chinese leadership did not lock down Hubei and Wuhan in the spring of 2020. Now, by and large, China's handling of the COVID it's a great success. You look at the recent Olympics, really opened eyes for many foreigners. Now, if the policy of zero tolerance later proves to be impossible or unattainable, and the world more or less accept coexisting with the virus, I believe Beijing will change its policy then and will not necessarily maintain the current policy. But at least you should have wait for a few more months.
So, Cheng Li, this policy, this zero COVID policy, it calls for things like snap lockdowns as well as travel restrictions. I mean, you mentioned it having a big economic impact. How are we seeing that impact in China?
Well, one of the major impact is the close of the small private firm. Of course, the small or so-called the Weixiao, it's a very small firms, largely private owned. You see the closure of these firms increase over the past 2 or 3 years, largely because of COVID, but also because of economic structure change. Now, this is related with employment, because this is the private small firms are the major places for employment. And plus, this year and in July, there will be 10 million, actually probably 11 million, according to Chinese official source. College graduates will graduate from college and will go to the market. Now, so employment challenge has always been a tough issue, but this year will be even tougher. I believe that the 2 sessions will discuss that issue in a very serious manner to provide jobs for college graduates, for those small business people. I think it's very, very important. I think the leadership certainly pays great attention on that issue.
Yan Liang, good to see you. The Chinese Premier, Li Keqiang, he will announce the growth target for the country at the National People's Congress. Now, this year, or at least last year, the economy grew, GDP grew by 8.1%. And that was really good. It was about the best the country has seen in the last decade. So what are expectations for 2022?
Good to talk to you again, Anna. So I think that is a very important question. Even though last year the growth was very strong, but it also benefited from the low base from the previous year, 2020, when the economy grew at a very low rate at about 3%. So I think last quarter of last year, the growth have slowed down to only about 4%. So I think and we're talking about a very unusual year where COVID is still rampant and the international situations are getting a lot more complex and with a lot more uncertainty. So I think the Chinese government will be careful in targeting the economic growth. So some of the estimates would say probably the government will have a range somewhere between 4.5% at the lowest to about 5.5%. That said, I think we also need to put this sort of growth target in context. I think China's goal is to double the economy from 2020 to 2035, and that basically requires about 4.8% growth rate per year. So I think that targeting 5% seems to be reasonable, and I think also with China's determination to continue with innovation, with job creation, and with fiscal support to the economy, I think it's not unreasonable to expect the economy to be growing at about 5%. The IMF just downgraded China's growth forecast back in January. Now they're looking at a growth rate about 4.6%. But again, for China, I think what is important is the long game, right? So the government has been talking about we need to have balanced, green, sustainable economy rather than trying to achieve high growth year by year.
And where do you see most of that growth coming from, Yan Liang?
Well, I think for one, the innovation, right, that technological innovations and industrial production in the sort of high-tech industry, that remain a really important, I think, growth spot. And second, I think the government realized that, consumption is very important. So they have been talking about broaden consumption. So that could be done in many different ways. But one of the things I think, as the previous speaker talked about, that COVID had a really significant impact on consumption, especially consumption of services. But COVID also helped to stabilize supply chain. So I think what the government would do is to really implement, tax cuts, government spending, especially infrastructure, and the varieties of fiscal support, and trying to broaden, consumption and to upgrade supply chain and stabilize supply chain. So all these, I think, would be very important for China's growth.
Joseph Gregory Mahoney, of course, these meetings focus on domestic issues, but as Ina told us at the beginning of the show, these gatherings are taking place right now when there's a war going on in Central Europe. These are very uncertain times. China has adopted a policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. But do you expect the war to be addressed during these meetings?
I don't know to what extent it will be addressed explicitly, but implicitly it must be addressed in some form or fashion. We're talking about growth rates, for example. One of the results or consequences of the war is that we've seen the Chinese currency, the yuan, increasing in value, but at the same time we're seeing inflationary pressures globally, which is not only going to affect potentially growth rates, which will therefore be a topic of concern during the two sessions. It will affect broader concerns like common prosperity. But I do think that there is sort of an interesting opportunity and a growing one for China to perhaps take a more direct role in perhaps negotiating some sort of settlement. I think China has, by abstaining in the UN Security Council, by having close relations with both Ukraine and Russia, by having so much at stake because of what this conflict has unsettled globally, that we may see China as the one country in the world at this point that can reach out to both and perhaps bring some peace and or at least an end to the worst part of the hostilities that we're seeing. That's a topic that's got a lot of discussion right now in China. I would like to add something about the dynamic COVID zero policies to follow on Cheng Li's comments. We are seeing a lot of indications here in China that there are high-level discussions that are ongoing about the policy and how it might be adjusted. And I think there are 2 points. The first is that they're really looking at holding the line for now, but drawing lessons from places where controls have been really successful, like Shanghai, and promoting these as best practices in other locations. And what's really unique about Shanghai is how they're able to target individual buildings and individual districts and limit the extent to which we have citywide disruptions. Second, they've also indicated in so many words that they're looking ahead to the spring and summer when new treatments will be available, when they've reached their vaccination rate goals, when we're past the Olympics and the Paralympics, when we're past the two sessions. And I think that's when they're suggesting we'll see some new adjustments made reflecting the dynamic part of the policy. And that word is really being emphasized now. It's no longer called just zero COVID. It's dynamic zero COVID. And I think that's what they want to signal as we go forward.
Cheng Li, what are your thoughts on how the war in Central Europe could impact China? I mean, we live in a globalized world right now. We live in an interconnected world. So will it have a significant impact on China?
Well, it's huge impact on China as the second largest economy. As your previous guest said, that China has strong ties with both Russia and the Ukraine. And also, this is related with economic and strategic with the Belt and Road Initiative. And also, to say the least, many Chinese students are currently in Ukraine. I mean, they are also in danger. Now, you see tremendous attention. I mean, I've never seen this kind of foreign policy issue that people watch so closely in China. And also, I never seen that the Chinese public, Chinese intellectual communities, Chinese economic elites and the political elites are all divided among each group on that issue, because it's presented a lot of complicities and a strategic challenge for China. Many Chinese are deeply concerned about whether or not U.S. and the U.S.-led European allies and also Asian allies will adopt the same sanctions against China, especially some U.S. Politicians and the commentators continue to assert that the number one enemy for the United States is China. Of course, that view should be reviewed in the U.S. But with the toxic nature of American domestic politics, with the former Secretary of State Pompeo has a high-profile visit to Taiwan, I think the Chinese are very much alert all these things. To a certain extent, the economic sanction against China also going on for other issues, for Xinjiang and etc. But this will be a different game. It's much larger. You look at the way that the U.S. deal with Russia. Now, also that the Chinese are really in ways shocked, because Deng Xiaoping always said, and other leaders always said, that the peace and development are the theme of the era. But now apparently certainly change. You see the international disorder. Now people will not be so naive, thinking this will be the last war, and also nuclear war may not be so remote. So it's a very troubling period for many parts of the world, not mentioning about the Ukraine people and also countries involved, but also deeply affected China. So how China respond, as the previous guest said, China has some leverage, China has some influence, because China is well positioned to serve as a peace dealer. But on the other hand, there's tremendous criticism of China. Some criticism are completely groundless, and some may have some validity. But again, I think that this is a strategic challenge. I hope that Chinese Beijing will certainly understand what's the best interest for China. Because certainly Chinese leaders talk about the peace and also common destiny. So this is a test. I think that China, I hope that we pass the test and continue to emerge as a positive force in the international communities.
Anna Tangen, talking about sanctions, President Putin of Russia, he was in Beijing, of course, at the beginning of the Winter Olympic Games. He had discussions with President Xi Jinping. They actually signed an agreement, a gas deal that's worth $117 billion. Looking at the sanctions that the United States and its allies and some other countries are trying to impose on Russia right now, how significant is that gas deal for both China and Russia?
Well, obviously, Putin is turning his back mostly on Europe. They still need his energy. But quite frankly, I mean, going forward, it's clear that Russia is going to get closer to China. China has the same, an even larger thirst for energy fuel, and it also needs a stable partner. They don't want to rely on anything that can be influenced by the U.S., and they're more concerned about Europe. And that's the broader issue on the international scale. It's just not just Putin. It is how does China balance its relationships? They're very concerned about what's happening in Europe and obviously in the U.S. with the America Competes Act. This seems to be more kind of fence building, wall building that is being done. And there's a concern that, China's closeness to Russia will be tarred by it. I think it's a political minefield for China to just, say, look, we'll settle this, because the U.S. and Europe will automatically jump on and say that China is hardly a, dispassionate viewer, that they've supported China. And this could be very, very difficult. I think it's going to have to be a situation where things on the ground are figured out, and then there's going to have to be some sort of resolution. I do think that at this time, the only sensible one is to create a zone of, some sort of zone that says no one is involved, either NATO or Russia. That would include Ukraine, the rest of the previous Soviet bloc countries, and perhaps some issues by NATO pulling weapons out of existing NATO allies who were part of the Soviet bloc. This would be space-saving for both sides. But if they continue with these kind of partial things, well, not things, these partial solutions that they've had in the past that haven't worked. You're just seeing a deteriorating situation. And unfortunately, that is bad for China. China really is standing right now for peace and development. They do not want any kind of conflict. And it's been very, very tough on Beijing to see this kind of unfolding out there because of its belief that there should be non-interference in the affairs of other countries.
Yan Liang, of course, with this war in Central Europe right now and all the uncertainty that comes with it, we are seeing skyrocketing gas prices right now. And of course, we are still experiencing supply chain issues. How will the crisis in Ukraine impact global growth and, of course, the supply chain?
Right. So obviously, I think this is going to be very disruptive for the global economy. So yes, Russia is the main energy exporter, and also Ukraine is one of the biggest, I think, grain producer and exporter. So I think what it's really put the world in danger is one, food security. Many countries, especially developing countries, are going to face with higher food prices, which could mean famines and starvation. And on the other hand, yes, the energy prices are going to be really crippling the very fragile economic recovery. So I think China has maintained this very strategic neutrality position and really called for de-escalation. And I think that is really the way to go. I don't think this war is benefiting anyone. So especially when it comes to the economic impact, we already have a lot of global challenges, be it economic recovery, be it pandemic control, be it climate change. So I think the sooner the two sides can come to agreement to cease fire and resume some sort of negotiation and make the world go back to the normalcy, I think the better. And again, I think China's position here is very delicate. I agree with the previous speaker, right? I think in principle, China is really advocating sovereignty and non-interference. And there's also a lot of economics at stake. Yes, Russia is China's biggest exporter to China, as the biggest energy provider. But at the same time, trade with EU is about $860 billion a year two-way trade. So I think it's very important to balance that economic and political and diplomatic relationships. And yet at the same time, I think China is playing a very important role in brokering some kind of peace negotiation. So yeah, unfortunately, I think the longer this war takes, the longer the economic globally would be suffered.
Joseph Gregory Mahoney, where do you see the China-Russia relationship going in the future? Because there is one consideration for China, of course, and that is when the United States imposes sanctions on a single country or a group of countries, it expects all other countries in the world to follow it. And I'm wondering, with this gas deal, for instance, will that increase tensions between Beijing and Washington?
Tensions were already increased to such a ridiculous and unsustainable level. If we talk about the fact that the Biden administration isn't able to resolve the trade war, despite the increasing inflationary pressures that are really driving his low approval ratings and threatening his party in the midterms. If he can't even act in his own self-interest there, we really have to wonder where things are going to go. I think the key to remember about what's happening in Ukraine is, there are, because we get this image from global media that everyone hates Russia except China, and that everyone supports the sanctions regime except China, but that's not the case. India doesn't support it, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, the UAE, many others. And they don't support it for a couple of reasons. One, because they understand that the economic damage. But secondly, because they're friends with Russia, and they also know that this is a level of economic warfare that we haven't seen before. One that doesn't seem just to be aimed at dissuading Russia's aggression in Ukraine, but perhaps even destroying Russia. And I think that strikes a lot of people as excessive, but also dangerous. Russia is still a major power. It's still a nuclear power. It's certainly a nuclear power with global reach, but tremendous.
Oh, Joseph, I'm sorry. I think we are having problems with your signal. Let me go to Cheng Li. Cheng Li, let's talk about the trade war. Of course, the trade war between China and the United States, that continues. In fact, there was a report out that came out in February which says that China fell short of its commitment to buy more U.S. goods and services. So do you expect that trade war and the tariffs that were put in place to continue?
Well, you probably first should we should better understand Chinese perspective. China wants to have a trade with the United States, and actually, according to Chinese Ambassador Cheng Li, who said a couple of weeks ago that the U.S. remained China's third largest trading partner last year, with an increase of 30% in trade, and the total bilateral trade reaching a record break of $756 billion US. Now, also, we should know that in the U.S., state and local governments still have enormous interest in economic engagement with China. According to one American study released last year, China was the largest import partner of 15 U.S. states in 2020, including California, New York, Florida, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Now, these are very important states run by both Democrats and Republican governors, and showing a completely different kind of bipartisan consensus. But in the Washington D.C., in the Capitol Hill, it's a different kind of consensus. I mean, in the last couple of years, each year they have the 300, 400 bills related with China, want to contain China, want to cut off with China, want all kinds of decoupling with China. Now, in my view, to keep its terror in place will hurt American middle class and working class. Yeah. This is also the Secretary of Treasury, also Janet Yellen also said, will worsen America's #1 imminent economic problem, which is inflation, and also it is the highest in the last 40 years. So that's the problem. So it's very difficult to know. The reason is some kind of strategy thinkers just completely ignore the American economic interest.
Joseph, my apologies. We lost your signal there for a moment, but you are back. We have a minute left. You were talking to us about the Russia-China relationship.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is this pressure for China to source more of their energy from Russia, and this exposes them, of course, to international criticism. But in terms of pragmatic, sound national policy, I think the gas deal before the conflict was smart. It will come under criticism, but we know that Western countries source their energy supplies from all sorts of countries that engage in wars and aggression in other places. So I think we have to avoid the double standard. But I think that as we look at this, a lot of countries are looking at this struggle as a case study. I mentioned before that a lot of countries are not supporting the sanctions. A lot of leading economies are not supporting the sanctions, but everyone's looking at how they might have to face similar risks down the line. They're looking past SWIFT. They're looking how they might manage and access foreign exchange reserves in a world where Switzerland no longer guarantees neutrality. They're thinking about technological autarky, and they're looking at, despite all the weaknesses and fault lines, a resurgent NATO, a resurgent U.S. hegemony, and strategizing accordingly.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.